It was a time when Rolexes were sort of available, and everybody asked the question, will Omega beat Rolex? It was a topic of discussion for years, and for some it seemed like an inevitability. But today, nobody asks that question anymore. But there's a new question, and it may be as silly as the old question. The question is, will Tudor beat Omega? Why even ask the question? I mean, is it even a relevant conversation? And honestly, no, it's not. Tudor is Tudor and Omega is Omega, and they do some things similarly and other things they do differently. But it's still an interesting question because of the context for the question. Stick around, there's a lot to unpack. Spoiler alert, Tudor won't beat Omega, at least not on the numbers in the next 5 to 10 years. According to the latest Morgan Stanley watch report, Omega makes around 570,000 watches. Tudor makes about 250,000. 2 years ago, the numbers were 230,000 and 500,000. That's a 14% increase and a 10% increase respectively over 2 years. We're in a slump right now, so those numbers will likely contract a little bit, but let's just assume that Omega does 3% more in growth on average every year. Give Tudor double that for argument's sake, and it's going to take 28 years for Tudor to catch up to Omega in terms of sales. Same goes for the prices. Tudor is about half price of what Omega gets on average for their watches. So if you just double the price increases of whatever Omega does to their price increases, and you still need a very long time before Tudor catches Omega. So the question from an objective metric perspective doesn't make sense. But there's still some credence to the underlying assumptions because of the products, the customers, the positioning, and the behavior of the brands and the way the market is going. Products, products, products. Jaeger-LeCoultre doesn't get compared with Omega. Why? Because they are a dress watch brand. When they do high complications, it's with the intention of establishing themselves as master movement makers, to some extent like Patek or Vacheron or Audemars Piguet. Omega does high complications, but they aren't at the core of what they do. What they do is divers and sports watches and chronographs. Omega is mainstream luxury and offers what a lot of people want, and the same goes for Tudor. Tudor and Omega have incredibly similar product lines. Tudor have their flagship divers in the Black Bay range with the 41mm as the most contemporary diver they have. Omega has the Seamaster 300M. Tudor has a flagship sports watch in the Black Bay as well. Omega has the Aquaterra. Tudor has the Chrono. Omega has the Speedmaster. Then Tudor has, let's call them the serious divers in the Pelagos lineup, which in some ways lines up with the Planet Oceans and the Ploprofs. Tudor even has dress watches in the 1908, which align with the DeVille lines from Omega. They both have an integrated sports watch. More and more, Tudor are also doing collab watches in specialist materials, just like Omega historically has done with their Speedmasters and other models. Their lineups are incredibly similar when it comes to the lines overall. When you dive into the lines, the differences are more apparent. Omega has a lot more variety within their lines. Just consider for a moment how many different variants of chronographs Omega has. They've got moon watches and Seamaster 300M chronos, to dual counters, to Speedmaster 57s. There's just a lot more to choose from. The same goes for dial and bezel colors for Aquaterras and Seamasters and Planet Oceans. It's also evident in terms of complications. You won't get a world timer and an annual calendar and a moon phase or multiple variations of chronograph movements. You get more sub-options with Omega, but the overall lineup is incredibly similar. Now, are Tudor going to end up having a lineup like Omega with tons of variants? I'm going hard on this one. I'm going to say absolutely not. I personally think Tudor is very much following more of the Rolex playbook when it comes to variety. Rolex has very few notable complications in their watches. At the entry steel level, Rolex doesn't have a lot of variety. They've got 3 Submariners, a date, a no date, and a green. The Seamaster 300M, they're like 8 plain steel variants. Why the difference? I've always thought that one of Omega's biggest strengths is also their biggest weakness. Having essentially only 3 Submariners, of which one is likely produced in extremely limited numbers, the costs are going to be low. You need fewer materials, you have fewer changes to your production lineup, you can pump out those limited number of variants cheaply and efficiently with little to no production stoppage. For Omega, they need to build and stock more movements, more dials, more bezels. They need more machines and more processes for the different dial types. It's great as a consumer that you have a lot of variety, but that variety does drive cost. And I think the Rolex style approach to variety keeps margins higher. This even comes down to cases. Rolex is by far the biggest offender because all their watches are variants of an incredibly simple case shape, the oyster. Omega, on the other hand, has twisted lugs and straight lugs and everything in between. Tudor strikes a bit more of a middle ground with limited Milan and Miami editions, but again, they've got this Rolex efficiency lean in the way they approach their lineups. It's interesting that there is that difference. I've always ascribed Omega's variety to being unfocused, and I still do believe that they are a bit all over the place sometimes. They're not always that consistent in what they put out in terms of making a coherent overall product lineup. But in fairness, they have likely made the calculation that variety is what draws customers in. People are likely buying blue Equateras and black dial Seamasters anyway. Having some more fringe options makes them look more appealing, despite them probably not selling that many of those fringe models. It just makes the display case look more interesting. Also, Omega is more global. Tudor is huge in the West, but step into a store in one of the huge malls in Bangkok or Singapore, and they are relatively speaking nobodies compared to the presence of Omega. These markets that YouTubers like me don't talk about a lot have very different tastes, and I think Omega's lineup does reflect appealing to those tastes. From a pure profitability perspective, I still do think Tudor is likely in a position to make more per watch by limiting variety to some extent. I do see Tudor continuing this trend in terms of model variety, but also in terms of complications. Niche annual calendars and the like are going to steal headlines every now and again, but I don't think they'll be at the core of what Tudor offers anytime soon. It's date, no date, and chronos for now at Tudor. This is also because the customers are a little bit different. Remember this when I say the next bit. If you're watching this video, you are not a normal watch consumer. Most watch buyers buy one watch and own it forever. A diver is a diver and a sports watch is a sports watch, but Tudor right now speaks to the regular Joe. I know $4,500 for a diver isn't regular Joe money, but the Tudor speaks to young people. It speaks to people that are outdoorsy. It speaks to people that are practical. It's not quite Ford F-150 customers, but even with the retro black bays, a lot of what Tudor offers has a level of down-to-earthness and practicality that Omega doesn't. Omega, on the other hand, is, despite what some YouTubers say, luxury. Omega is about practical sophistication. James Bond is a sophisticated spy. George Clooney is the mature hunk. Eddie Redmayne, Nicole Kidman. It's not that Tudor isn't sophisticated or their customers aren't, but the Omegas target a price point of customers that talk about Grüne Veltliner and Chardonnays and Pinot Grigios, where Tudor is for the India Pale Ale kind of crowd. This isn't just branding though, because it does shine through in the lineup as well. More precious metal options speak to another type of customer. Movements do a lot of things, but for customers, they signal refinement and elegance. An annual calendar Pelagos wouldn't make sense to a practically orientated customer. A chronograph has a practical use case. The fixed lugs of a Pelagos have a practical use case. Moon phases are cool, but useless for the regular Joe. Just in general, Omega is more likely to put out a watch that has some intricacy to it or some complication that gives it that air of refinement and class, where until now, at least, Tudor sends a far more simple, down-to-earth, practical message. For sure, you can wear your Jubilee Bracelet Black Bay to a formal event and it will work just great, but Tudor does want you to kind of ride your mountain bike with this watch. So far, you should be thinking Tudor and Omega look the same on the surface, but dig deep enough and you'll see that they're quite different. And this is where I throw a curveball at you. One word, Metas. Until last year, the only brand that made movements that were produced in large numbers that were approved by Metas were Omega. The Omega coaxial movement is at least by some considered to be one of the best movements and movement innovations in recent history. The Metas approval is considered to be the most stringent Swiss test of a watch there is, and only Omega really had it. Omega did it to prove they were the best. They did it to tell the world that they were better than Rolex. Did they ever mention Rolex? No, but that was always their intent, to establish themselves as the manufacturers of the most solid mass-produced watches in the world and to move upmarket. And now, Tudor has Metas. They've had a Metas movement for a while, but only last year did they start producing them in significant numbers. And why did they do that? Because of Omega. Like I said, Tudor is largely known for good-looking, robust, practical watches. Metas makes perfect sense. What communicates that you have the best movement and watch out there to a practical crowd? Metas, of course. Metas communicates value much more than a moon phase or a perpetual calendar. And it does communicate that Tudor is taking on Omega, just not in the way that you think. We get caught up in these discussions of Rolex versus Omega and Tudor versus Omega. We forget the simple numbers game that make Tudor overtaking Omega almost an impossibility. We also focus solely on the brands as they are right now, at this point in time. I think Tudor is trying to do and be what Omega once was. Before 1990-ish, Omega was in a difficult position. Historically, Omega have had many periods of difficulty, but they were in a really tough place in the 90s. Then Jean-Claude Biver joined and revived the company with the Bond franchise, the Seamaster 300M, Cindy Crawford, and a whole lot of others. In 1999, Omega released the coaxial escapement, and it marked an acceleration for Omega. After years of relative obscurity, much like Tudor, they had introduced new models and new movement innovations. In 2002, they released the first Aquaterra. In 2006, the second generation of the 300M was released with that new coaxial escapement. 2015 was the first year with Metas. The late 20th and early 21st century was for Omega all about re-establishing themselves as a venerable mass producer of high quality watches. Not just that, they initially emphasized value, not by talking about price, but by pushing the envelope in terms of models, features, specifications, and quality. Coaxial, Metas. As they got a stronger foothold in the minds of people that wanted a good watch, they slowly upped the price, moving them upmarket, making them less premium and more luxury. An Omega Speedmaster Professional used to be a bargain for the price. The Seamaster 300M was also a bargain for the price. It was a practical, no-nonsense, serious diver without all the baggage of Rolex snobbery. It's still desirable, but not in that snobbish Rolex kind of way. Rolex back then was still luxury, but not to the degree that it is today. Rolex was in a refined, upscale, I've arrived space, at least here in the West. And what's happened since then? Well, Rolex are no longer refined. A lot of their models are extreme status symbols that are largely out of reach for people without a purchase history or extra money to burn on grey market pricing. What Rolex have done is they have stepped up a couple of rungs on the ladder, and so have Omega. Both those brands have moved up a rung or two in terms of positioning. And that's where Tudor comes in. Back in 2012, when Tudor was relaunched, they were very much positioned as a bang for your buck kind of brand. They were breaking the rules by offering a lot of watch for a decent price. The whole original mindset about Tudor is captured in the almost derogatory term, the poor man's Rolex. This was an affordable, well-made, mass-produced, mass-market offering to the regular gentleman. But that's not the case anymore. Tudor have, with every single step they've taken, slowly removed themselves from the space where brands like Baume & Mercier, Bell & Ross and Longines are. Longines and Tudor for a time were comparable offerings, but now with Metas and their emphasis on upscale things like Jubilee bracelets and lifestyle-orientated Pelagos 39s, Tudor is distancing themselves from all of those value-offering kind of brands. The journey Tudor has been taking has so much in common with Omega's 90s and early 2000s journey. The understanding that you can't re-establish your brand without new product. The understanding that branding needs to fit with the times. So superstars were Omega's thing in the 90s. Tudor has their semi-edgy hipsters and artists like Lady Gaga and David Beckham today. And as Omega got a grip on their customers, they improved the product, differentiating it from the competition, lifting them above the rest, allowing them to charge a higher price and moving more away from any sort of value or premium segment. Omega is a luxury brand now. And sure, no, they're not luxury compared to Patek or AP or Vacheron, but they're not just a premium value brand. In a lot of ways, that's very much the same trajectory I think Tudor's on. Right now, with a watch like the Metas Black Bay 41 monochrome at $4,400, you are no longer purely in a premium or value-focused space. There's more and more a luxury component to that watch's pricing than there was to the first gen of the Heritage Black Bay. Which brings us full circle back to the original question. Is Tudor beating Omega? No, but I understand why the question gets asked. The excitement that people likely felt about Omega in the 90s and the early 2000s is the excitement a lot of people have had for Tudor in the last 10 years. They were at their respective times among the brands that most people took an interest in. It's likely more intense for Tudor because of the internet and YouTube and other social media, but it's at a core level the same excitement and passion. The reason some people ask the question of whether Tudor will beat Omega is because right now Tudor has been exciting and Omega hasn't. That's not as such a criticism of Omega. Omega is just more settled. They've been through the revitalization. They've had the customer honeymoon, and they're beyond that now. Now they're in a place where they are stable and popular and desirable and are focused primarily on maintaining that position. Now, whether that makes them complacent is a question for another time. Whether they are losing ground to other luxury brands is also a question for another occasion. But apart from generating excitement for new models, they don't need that same fervor and honeymoon romance in the way that they did in the 90s. They are an established luxury brand with massive positive brand recognition and a fairly stable flow of customers that keeps the business where it is. This was also why the Omega versus Rolex question was always asked. Omega was on a roll while Rolex was settled. The Rolex excitement wasn't there because Rolex honestly didn't even need it back then. The 2015 Ceramic Daytona did kick off a new era for Rolex, but it largely wasn't because of something Rolex did. Everybody was excited about Omega in the 90s because they were on a roll and they needed to be on a roll. Tudor also needed that excitement. They were also languishing. They succeeded at creating the Omega type excitement, and that excitement is what has pushed Tudor to where they are today. And it's also what's allowing Tudor to move into a more stable phase eventually, where the growth isn't as dramatic, but the brand is established and the customers are loyal, and most importantly, they set themselves apart from so many others, just like Omega did. For me, these two brands illustrate how clearly creating excitement and being able to capitalize on that excitement is important to put you on the map. It's no guarantee that the initial excitement phase is enough though. You just take an example like the Tissot and the PRX. That was a great watch, but Tissot haven't been able to create more excitement and new excitement for other models. One watch isn't enough. Sometimes the excitement just doesn't happen. Just think of Bremont. They're trying the exact same thing as Tudor and Omega to create a new brand with new products and new levels of excitement. And for Bremont, they got the new brand, they got the new products, but there's no level of excitement as, anything similar to Omega or Tudor. It's still early days in the context of Bremont, but what Tudor and Omega illustrate for me is how they are shining examples of how to do a relaunch right. They are both fabulous examples of being able to create an initial excitement and hold that excitement for long enough to put them on a whole other more solid footing. The question was never about Tudor beating Omega. It was rather, are Tudor and Omega among the brands that have done these kind of relaunches best? Have they beaten all the others? The answer to that question is yes. At their respective times, they did. Omega dominated in the 90s and 2000s, and Tudor has dominated for the last 10 years or so. That's my thinking, at least. So here's my question to you. Tudor, I think, is moving out of the excitement phase and are becoming more settled, just like Omega did. So who's next for that excitement phase? Who should we be taking a look at? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.